Thanks, Trevor. I don't like to use microphones. You think it's going to be okay if you can't hear me? Okay. Trevor said, you don't avoid the microphone at your own risk. So I've learned. All right, Trevor, thank you very much. Trevor has done marvelous things with this museum in the few years that he's been here, and he deserves our every support. So thanks again. Gosh. On a nice Saturday afternoon, here you are to listen to an old history story, and I hope to make it a little bit other than old, and I hope to make it enjoyable. The one thing I forgot to do is to bring my slide advancer, so I'm going to be ducking over here to do this. So an 81-year-old writing a book on medical history, well, it actually started 20 years ago, actually 22 years ago now, when I retired from my practice at Kaiser here in Vallejo. I started out as a history major in undergraduate school at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, but quickly switched when I found the reading to be just overwhelming, and math and science was so much easier, especially a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry. A Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry, which in those days there were no pre-med curricula in colleges, so that was kind of like a pre-med curriculum. I then went to Albany Medical College in my state capital, and from there started an internship in Chicago. Now, when I was in medical school, this was during the Vietnam conflict, there was a 100% doctor's draft. So you knew that when you graduated from medical school, you were going to go into the service. I knew I did not look good in green, and I did not want to sleep in the mud. And a friend of mine found that the Navy had a program called the Ensign 1915 program, where they would pay you ensign's pay for your senior year of medical school that you would then pay back with an extra year of active duty. So after a civilian internship, I went on active duty, spent a year in destroyers, 3 months of which were in the South China Sea. That's my Vietnam service. I tell people that my Vietnam War was, hey Chief, it's getting a little bit warm in sickbay, can you turn up the air conditioning? And then 2 years at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Now this is two Easterners. Gina grew up in coal country, Pennsylvania, and I grew up in dairy country, New York State. Two Easterners who present themselves in Monterey, California, almost as a first experience in California, and that's paradise. And that's where we caught the California disease. So we knew that after I finished my residency at Rush Medical College in Chicago, we were going to come back to California. And I had the great good fortune of going to work for the Kaiser Permanente organization. That's kind of my past, my history. So I combined it. After I got off of active duty, and after a year in residency, I was reading Herman Wouk's The Winds of War. Do you remember that novel? It was a really wonderful novel about a Navy captain who was on his way to Hawaii to pick up his battleship command. And of course, his battleship was sunk before he got there, so it's his adventures after that. But I was so inspired, I went back into the Navy, into the reserves, and I spent a wonderful career in the Navy Reserve, retiring in 1997. Now, it's been traditional, at least in the past, for doctors to write medical history. certainly up to the mid-20th century, physicians were the writers mostly. And in the early days, physicians were classically educated, so they could read Greek and they could read Latin, so they could translate Galen and the original writers in medicine. But that began to change. Now, this is a picture of medical historians in Leipzig in 1929. You'll notice two things if you can see the picture. They're all white, and what you can't see is all of them are doctors except one. So physicians were the writers of medical history until about the mid-20th century, when the PhD historians came in, and the nature of medical history changed. When doctors were writing medical history, it was what we would refer to nowadays as famous man history. That is, the doctors who advanced the art and science of medicine. I mean, you remember names like DeBakey, who was a famous cardiac surgeon, and so on. They advanced the art and science. These were the famous men. When the PhD historians came in, the nature of medical history changed, and it became more of a social history. So, for instance, we learned about the untreated cohort of guys who had syphilis who were untreated, and they simply were followed for their career, for their entire life, in a way to study the natural course of untreated syphilis, but terribly unethical. And it was the PhDs who could write about that, the doctors being maybe too embarrassed to think about things like that. In any case, I've aimed to do both in this book. I've got some famous fellows, or relatively famous fellows, almost always fellows in the early years, but also some social history. This is just a picture of kind of the places where I did my research, which started, as I mentioned, 22 years ago. I did the research going back east to Washington on a quarterly basis, spending a couple of weeks at a time in the National Archives. So the National Archives are the upper left here. The inscription, which you can't read, is "The past is prologue." The past is prologue. The history is telling us what the future is going to be about. The next one is the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where Navy history after 1942 is archived. And of course, our own Naval and Historical Museum, where I did a lot of work with the newspapers that they have in the cellar, going through dusty old newspapers. Archival work is dusty. I stayed with my kids when I was back east. They always knew where I'd been during the day, because I would come home covered with this brown dust from the archives. Incidentally, those newspapers, which Brendan and I have both leafed through down there, are now all digitized. So it's magical now. You can do a word search in an electronic archive and find the same articles that it took us weeks and months to leaf through. The lower picture is the San Francisco National Archive, which is actually in San Bruno, California. It's a brutalist building on the outside. It has a very nice reading room on the inside. The magic about archives is you walk in, you've already got your researcher card, you fill out a form requesting a range of dates and so on and so forth, and 2 hours later, out on carts come these books. I mean, I say that archivists are the heroes of history. They're the ones that preserve our history, and without archivists, we would be in a much sadder state. My story is not complete until I tell you about Harry Langley. So, when I first started this endeavor back in D.C., there was the historian at the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery introduced me to Harry Langley. Harry had been a history professor at Catholic University, and then he was the curator of the Navy collection at the Smithsonian. And Harry took me. I mean, he embraced my efforts to write medical history. He was a wonderful mentor, gentle, but he taught me a lot. One of the things he taught me is, in your historical searches, be aware of rabbit holes. You will end up going down a bunch of rabbit holes as you study history, and that's part of the reason why this project took me 20 years, is going down rabbit holes. Anyway, Harry always wore a tie and jacket, even when he was in the archives. Nowadays, you go to the National Archives, and the researchers, the PhD, the graduate students, are in cutoffs and sandals and shorts. I mean, but he always wore a tie and jacket, which is why I present myself as historian in tie and jacket every time. It's due to Harry's example. A wonderful, wonderful mentor and a gentle soul and a model historian. Oh, incidentally, he was the guy who wrote the first history of medicine in the Navy for the American Navy. So that's his past. Healthcare at Mare Island, 1854 to 1870, the early years. So when Farragut arrived, when Commander Farragut, that's equivalent to Lieutenant Colonel for you Army and Marine types, when the Lieutenant Colonel Farragut arrived at Mare Island in 1856 to found the Navy base, 2 days later, he had the sloop of war Warren towed over from Sausalito. This is Warren in her better days, obviously. He had her towed over from Sausalito, and aboard that ship was Medical Officer John Brown, Assistant Surgeon John Brown. John Brown had graduated from Harvard's medical school and a year later was on active duty in the Navy on the West Coast. Now think about that. There's no Stanford down the road to refer your tough cases to. He is the guy to take care of Navy and civilians on the West Coast. This is John Brown in his later years. This is actually a picture of him in the, Gina, help me out. It'll come to me. Anyway, so he was a senior leader of one of the local, he was a Mason, the Freemasons. He was a Freemason, and he was a local poobah in the Masons Lodge. I have a theory that you had to be a Mason to be an officer in the military, because that was the way you proved you weren't Catholic. And in fact, another fellow that I'll introduce to you later, I just learned that he was a Freemason too. Anyway, this ship was really small and uncomfortable, and soon this ship arrived, the USS Independence. This is the ship cut down, obviously, and roofed over. This ship, Independence, served as the receiving ship for Mare Island until the 1920s. But she was also a medical facility for a while. The doctors, being medical officers, complained back to the Navy about how unpleasant and inhospitable the environment was to be aboard a ship if you're sick. It's cold, it's windy, the cold winds blow. They didn't like it, so they would be writing back to the Bureau saying, we really need to have a real hospital. Well, in the 1860s, in the early 1860s, there was something else going on in this country. They were not worried too much about this little remote base on the Pacific coast, so the local doctors took the bull by the horns and converted this building over here, which was an unused greenery, into a hospital. And so that became the first, quote, hospital. Now, they would write letters back to the Bureau with the heading U.S. Navy Hospital, Mare Island, and the Bureau would write back saying, you're not a hospital, you can't call yourself a hospital. But nevertheless, this served as a real hospital, and I think I have an example here. Let's see if we change slides again. Nope, I don't. So there was a fellow. There was an operation that was done there in that facility. It was a sailor who'd been shot in the hip in a cutting out expedition off the Mexican coast. A cutting out expedition is where a ship with boats in rows will seek. There was a ship that had been taken by pirates, and the Navy had gone to retrieve that ship. They called it cutting out because they would take the ship and steal it back from the pirates. And this fellow got shot in his hip, and it was fractured into multiple fragments. How did we know that? There was no x-ray. They probed it. So he was in constant pain, he was infected, he was losing weight. We would say now he's a failure to thrive. He was going to die if they didn't operate on him to remove his hip. And as it turns out, one of the 8 surgical gentlemen present at that operation was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo's son, Platon, who was, you remember Vallejo is the last Mexican governor of California and very pro-American. His son, Platon, went to Columbia Medical School in New York, first Californio to go to an American medical college. Before that, I suppose they went to Spain or to South American medical school. He graduated from PNS in New York, presumably second in his class. I called the Alumni Association there and asked, and they said, well, we can't tell you that because it was a pass-fail system back in those days. But what we can tell you is that Vallejo's graduating thesis on the secretions of the kidneys won second prize that year. Anyway, so Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was one of the 8 surgical gentlemen present to operate on that fellow in that primitive facility. The guy walked out of the hospital 3 months later. Now, as I mentioned, right from the get-go, the complaint back east was we need a proper hospital facility. And Congress actually had passed a budget for $100,000 to build a hospital. And finally, a Philadelphia architect by the name of MacArthur was contracted. MacArthur was known to the Bureau because he'd built hospitals, Navy hospitals in Annapolis and in Philadelphia, to build a naval hospital on Mare Island. And this is the structure that he designed. Interestingly enough, the main administrative building in my college, Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, looks just like this, and it was designed by the Philadelphia architect MacArthur. In any case, this palatial, was referred to as palatial building, opened in 1871. I love this picture because you can see a whole bunch of stuff. You see that thing there is a floating dry dock. And that's the reason why Mare Island existed as a shipbuilding or ship repair facility. The Navy built that to bring it over to take care of the Pacific Squadron that was out here. You can also see the officers' quarters. I think there's a Marine barrack over here. Now you also see you can see a windmill, which sits actually in a ravine that went down alongside of the hospital, and a small building over there with what looks like maybe a pipe going up to the hospital. Well, Philadelphia architect MacArthur had never been in California, so he didn't realize that it doesn't rain here from May till whatever. But he designed it so that rain collected from the roof would run into cisterns as a water supply to the hospital. Well, obviously that didn't work. They ran out of water the first year, so the first thing they did was they sunk a well in that ravine. It turned out the water that was there was brackish, so they had to build a still to purify the water. And then later, when they wanted to convert from kerosene lamps to gas lamps, they built a gas-producing facility, and that pipe is actually gas line running up to the hospital. So already you see some scientific advance from kerosene lanterns to gas lighting. We're making progress here in California. So that building opens in 1871. So I say the last quarter of the last century, the 19th century, was in a way very similar to what we're experiencing now in the way of scientific and technological advances. And so in this case, we went from kerosene to gas, and then ultimately electricity for lighting. We developed telephones. So imagine in the early days, when there were no telephones, a guy down on the waterfront gets hurt. Now it's a mile to the hospital, so you have to send a runner down to you have to send a runner up to the hospital saying, "Send the ambulance down. We got a guy down here who's injured." Now you can pick up the phone. Same thing inside the hospital. From first floor, from third deck, if you will, in Navy terms, to the first deck. So the heating is in the basement, and you're up on the third deck, and you want the heating turned down. What do? Well, the Navy original Navy construction had voice tubes. This is true in ships. So you know, if you're up on the bridge and you want to tell the gunners to do something, you have a voice tube you yell into. Well, this hospital had the same thing. So you went from voice tubes to, well, you could actually pick up the communicator, the phone, and call down below and say, "Send blah blah blah." Now I mentioned water. So they did the brackish water. That ran out. Then they contracted with the city of Vallejo for water for Lake Chabot. That ran out. They were actually sending out lighters, ships that had pumps and tanks to take water from local creeks for water. But finally, in 1895, a 25-mile pipeline from Green Valley brought water in, and that was the last I heard about water problems until World War II. And then finally, a purpose-built operating room. What? So there wasn't a purpose-built operating room in that hospital? Well, the answer is they had a very nice table in the conference room. And if they needed to do an operation, they waited till sunrise, sunup, because you didn't have the lighting you had was gas lighting, and the anesthesia of the day was ether, which is terribly inflammable. So you couldn't do that, and you had to wait for sunup. Now the windows ran from ceiling, from floor to ceiling. They referred to them as lights, in point of fact. So you waited till morning. Well, just imagine. So the Bureau finally says, in roughly 1890, it writes a letter to every naval hospital in the world. There were 14 of them or 15 of them then, saying, we think that modern medicine, modern surgery requires the construction of an operating room. And this is what you'll do. And they went and specified the paint that would be used, the tile that would be used, the brand of table, the brand of explosion-proof electric light in the overhead. And it was all done. And this was not typical of the Navy at the time. At the time, typically, the communication went the other way. It would be a local commander writing back to the Bureau saying, this is a problem we're having. What recommendations do you have for solving it? This is one of the first, what I call top-down communications from the Bureau saying, this is what you will do to build an operating room. Well, guess what? So that's such a remarkable thing to have electric lighting and a purpose-built operating room that the first time they did an emergency operation for appendectomy prompted a letter back to the Bureau. So can you imagine from waiting for the sun to come up in the morning to flicking on a switch to do surgery is just a remarkable accomplishment. And they actually wrote back to the Bureau saying, last night we performed our first emergency appendectomy under artificial lighting to the great satisfaction of all concerned. So the other thing that Philadelphia architect MacArthur wasn't aware of, apparently, maybe he wasn't reading his architectural journals, was that California has earthquakes. And the building that he specified was entirely masonry. Now, the local supervisors of construction, which was one, that Surgeon Brown, but also an engineer by the name of Brown, they noticed, they observed this. They wrote back to the Bureau saying, you know, we've noticed that the masonry chimneys out here don't do well in earthquakes. And so what we recommend is that this building be reinforced with steel rods in the corners and maybe even steel bands wrapping around the building. And they actually specify the cost to the penny. And the Bureau approved of these reinforcements so that when the earthquake, the Mare Island earthquake, estimated to be 6.5 on the scale, happened, the building was seriously damaged, but it didn't collapse. And nobody was hurt and nobody was killed. So that steel reinforcement did work. And that was the local folks telling the Navy that this is what should be done. Within 2 months, Congress appropriated another $100,000 to build another hospital. But they specified that it would go on the foundation of the hospital that I showed you, the first hospital. There's a story behind that too, and that is, so the guy who got the contract for that original hospital was a San Francisco builder by the name of Jordan. And his bid came in at 20% less than the next bid up. And we think the reason why is because he walked the land where the building was going to be built and realized that he was going to be digging clay out for the cellar of the hospital, and he decided that he would burn that clay into bricks himself. So he created 1.5 million bricks. They didn't have to pay for transport or for construction. He made them himself. That's probably why he came in at 20% less. Well, so it's supposed to be on the foundation. Though you can see those bricks today if you walk past this building. Well, so, but is that really real that this is the case? So I'm searching the internet, and lo and behold, there's a brick guy out there. I mean, his interest is bricks. And so I wrote him and saying, listen, Dennis Jordan built a hospital and the new hospital was on it, and do you think that you can find out if you think these are Dennis Jordan bricks? And he literally wrote back to me saying, you think you've got Dennis Jordan bricks? Well, the next day he came by and he checked that, and he wrote me back saying, yes, I'm convinced that the bricks that you see were the ones that were burned by Dennis Jordan when he built the original hospital, and here are the reasons why. So we're pretty content that when you walk by this, you put your hands on the bricks. Those bricks are from 1871. Very high quality bricks. Anyway, this building was designed by a DC architect by the name of Poindexter, who may have been reading his architectural journals, because he builds this hospital to be resistant to earthquake by making it out of wood. So the construction is Oregon fir on the outside and California redwood. It's clad in California redwood. This is now is referred to as H1 and was the main hospital on the Mare Island Naval Hospital complex until the 1930s. That building still stands, but without the little building on the porte cochere at the top. Incidentally, when you drive by there now, you'll see that the beams have been damaged by the Napa earthquake, and they're now being repaired. Nurses in the Navy. So now the Army had nurses during the Spanish-American War, 1898 and 1900. The Navy had nurses too, but they were volunteers. There were 3 women medical students from Johns Hopkins and 1 from MIT who came and volunteered to be nurses for the Navy during the Spanish-American War. The Navy loved them, but they could do nothing except thank you very much for your service when the war was over. But from that point on, the Navy medical establishment complained to Congress that we should have a nurse corps. So the way this works is the Surgeon General of the Navy writes to the Secretary of the Navy saying we need money to create a nurse corps, and the Secretary of the Navy goes to Congress, and Congress either votes it up or votes it down. So finally, after 8 years of this, Congress approves a Navy nurse corps. And then a year later, Miss Martha Pringle, one of the best nurses in the Corps, is detailed to come to California. Now imagine, and these women were all single. If you got married, you were out of the Navy back in the day. So these gals were all single. She looks like a formidable person. And I think you would have to be formidable to travel across the country by yourself and then to establish yourself. And now here she is, all in white. I mean, this is nursing, right? So in Vallejo, they looked for a place for her on the Navy Yard and couldn't find one, so she had to live downtown. That meant in the summertime, she would be on a wagon in a dusty, dirty, and then in the wintertime, it would be cold, wet, and muddy. And I mean, this life is not simple back in the day. And actually, after a year or so of her being here, the doctors here were writing back to the Bureau saying, you really need to send some more nurses. Miss Pringle's getting really lonely out here and really getting dispirited. But she was the beginning of nursing, Navy nursing on Mare Island.
I think that slide is of the Sacred 20.
That's correct, the Sacred 20. That's my medical officer colleague is talking about the Sacred 20, the first nurses in the Navy Nurse Corps. So medical people think about the tests of war, just as every person in the service thinks about the test of war. And for Mare Island, our first test of war, I put in quotes, was during World War I, but it was not. We had nothing to do with combat casualty care because World War I was fought in Europe. But what we did have was the influenza, the Spanish flu that came through. It was a horrible disease. This was a cartoon that was in the Mare Island Bulletin, the local newspaper, and I love it. The little sailor saying, gee, here's the directions for having influenza, just what I've been looking for. And he sneezes, oh gosh, the sneezelet. Doc, I sneezed, and I hear the beds are very soft and the chow very, very good in the hospital. Well, as it turns out, the Spanish flu, as far as the Navy is concerned, started on the East Coast near Boston. And then it spread centrifugally across the country to Chicago. And then from Chicago, it spread to the West Coast. And when the Chicago guys wrote to the Mare Island guys with their experience, in essence, what they did is they wrote a letter saying, so here's our experience. Of the people, the civilians and Navy people that you have assigned to your facility, you can expect X% to come down with the flu. And of those, you can expect X% to come down with pneumonia. And so what these guys did with those numbers is they did the calculations and they realized that they had enough beds in the hospital to take care of the pneumonia cases. These are the guys now, this flu pandemic was horrible and unusual because it affected young people worse than it did older people. And what happened was the younger people, their immune system overreacted to the virus and they developed a fulminating pneumonitis, an inflammation of the lungs. So a guy would said that a young sailor would show up at the hospital feeling poorly in the morning and be dead by 4 in the afternoon. I mean, it was just a horrible disease. But the pneumonia guys needed to be hospitalized to be taken care of. What they did with the others, the flu cases that did not have pneumonia, is they built tents outside of the facility, and they put the flu patients in the tents. Now, being outdoors in California isn't terrible in November. It's not terrible. I mean, it's a livable thing. And what they were doing was they were doing their public health right. They were getting the flu guys out of the community and into a facility where they could be taken care of, be fed, and all that. Now, there's, in this picture, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 buildings. These were buildings that were actually part of, quote, emergency construction during World War I. Congress appropriated huge amounts of money to the Navy, some of which they didn't know what to do with. So in the case of Mare Island, they said, well, listen, we'll build you 6 pavilions. Don't really need them, but we've got 6 pavilions. Well, guess what? That becomes part of the hospital where the pneumonia patients are taken care of. So just by luck or providence, we had enough beds to take care of the pneumonia patients, and the flu patients were treated in the tents. Now, in medicine, as in the military, we tend to fight the last war again, okay? And in this case, an earlier influenza pandemic was caused by a bacterium called Haemophilus influenzae, a germ. Our flu, the Spanish flu, was caused by a virus. They didn't know anything about that back then. Only one virus had been described at that point. It was called the tobacco mosaic virus, and it was a huge virus, and it infected plants, not people. So they didn't know what the heck they were treating, but you fight the last war. So what they're doing here is they're spraying these sailors with phenol, with carbolic acid, which was an antibacterial to kill the germ that didn't exist. But that was last time's war. This young medical officer was one of 2 who died of the influenza here at Mare Island. Now, the quiet before the storm. So what's interesting, from a historical standpoint, there's a tremendous volume of correspondence that goes back and forth between Mare Island and the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery up until about 1930. So you can count on a nice historical record. 1930, the volume of communication just plummets. And I think the reason why is I can now call Washington, D.C. I don't have to write a letter anymore. So the historical record kind of gets thin in the 1930s, and so I'm going to the local newspapers to find stuff. And what the local newspapers are about are Navy guys taking vacations, or some famous person comes to visit the hospital, or something like this. But what we can surmise is, with the Great Depression, there were budget cuts, and there were complaints about that. There were staff cuts, they needed more doctors, but they couldn't hire them, and so on and so on. And austerity is the word of the day, right? But by 1938, the winds of war begin to appear, and there are preparations. Now, FDR was a very, very wise fellow. He knew that America was isolationist at that point, so he had to be very subtle in his preparations. But I'll give you an example of one of the preparations that he did do. Is he called for the call-up of Navy doctor reservists, starting in 1938 and 1939. So already we're beginning to make the moves to prepare for what we really need when the time comes. And he realized that war was going to be inevitable, probably. One of the other things the FDR did was he appointed this fellow as the Surgeon General of the Navy. Ross McIntyre was an ENT doc that FDR got to know when he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the 1920s. He had sinus problems, and his Navy doctor friend said, listen, the best ENT guy in the Navy is this guy McIntyre. You got to get to know him. Well, it turns out they became really good friends. And so when it came time to appoint a Surgeon General to run his war, to run the medical department during war, FDR chose McIntyre to be his Surgeon General. Now, at the time, McIntyre was a Navy commander, which would be equivalent to a lieutenant colonel, I guess. But he was immediately promoted to 2-star admiral. We call that deep selection in the Navy. He was selected deep for a high rank. But he was an administrative genius, and here are some of the examples of what he did. The Navy started out with 19 hospitals at the beginning of the war, actually 18, because the Naval Hospital at Canyacao in the Philippines had been bombed by the Japanese and was no longer usable. But by the end of the war, we had 99 hospitals, but also a lot of hospital ships and temporary hospitals and field hospitals. He expanded it from 840 docks to more than 14,000 doctors, from 439 nurses to more than 10,000. And look at from the number of corpsmen, the enlisted healthcare helpers, from 4,200 to more than 130,000. He oversaw all of that. I mean, he was an administrative genius. Now, he's also, and he did this while also being FDR's personal physician when FDR was the president. So, I mean, he was a busy guy. He's also controversial because, well, for one thing, he was criticized for maybe not taking good care of FDR. FDR, you know, was pretty sick toward the end. He had high blood pressure and a bunch of other things and actually died of a stroke. So McIntyre has been criticized, but it turns out that's not true. He had called in the best specialists in the country, as you might expect, to take care of the president. So, but I think the ultimate thing is that when FDR died, his medical record disappeared. And we think that probably McIntyre was behind that. But a genius nevertheless. Okay, our second test of war, and the real test of war for Mare Island is World War II. So on Christmas Eve, 178 casualties. So the attack is on the 7th of December. On Christmas Eve, 178 casualties from that attack show up at Mare Island. Now, 178 are the sickest. These are the guys with the severe burns and the severe fractures. Fortunately, only one died on the way, on the transport. So the rest of them arrived, really sick guys. I got to tell you, when I was a resident, if we had more than 3 admissions a night, we complained like hell. They had 178. Now, one of the concerns at the time back at the Bureau was, you got a bunch of reservists in your hospital. How are they going to do? How are they going to take care of these patients? Are they going to be up to the task? They're not real military doctors, they're reservists. Well, the letters going back from the Bureau in the next few days said, these guys, and they're all guys, again, back in the day, and the nurses were fabulous, but these guys, they pitched in, they worked all night, they took care of business. So everybody breathes a big sigh of relief. The reservists are actually going to work out okay. One of my themes, and I'll mention this again, is innovation in Mare Island and Mare Island, the California story of innovation. This is one of my favorites. So the standard treatment of burns, now remember, a lot of the guys that came in from Pearl Harbor and in the future were victims of burns, you know, gasoline, flies, and burning, I mean, terrible burns. So burn treatment is a big deal. The standard treatment back in the day was to paint the burns with, basically it's tree bark boiled in water. So what it would do is form an artificial scab over the burn. But if you wanted to see how things were healing, you had to peel it off. You know, so there's a dermatologist from Salt Lake City who comes up with this idea of using paraffin, which is wax, Vaseline, cod liver oil, and sulfa, which is an antibiotic, and spray it on the wounds with a flit gun. How many of you guys have actually seen or used a flit gun? There are a few of you. I remember, so I grew up on farms in upstate New York, and I remember my uncle putting, you know, bug spray in this can and then spraying it in the barn before he milked the cows. You want to get rid of the flies, right? Anyway, so you spray this on the burns. Now, I apologize for the quality of the picture that's here, but you use what you get, you make use of what you got. This is the only one I could find. This is a corpsman spraying the sailor with the flit gun, and you can see he's got a big old smile on his face. They love this, you know, because they've got instant relief of pain. They could leave the burns open so you could inspect them, but also since you had a burn on your arm, say for instance, you didn't have a dressing on, so you could actually continue using your arm, so you weren't losing function. I mean, it was a beautiful innovation. I don't know what happened to that after the war. I don't know if it ever existed, but that was an innovation that happened at Mare Island. Oh, and there's a letter in the files of a sailor that's got a hold of one of these things. Says, I'm taking this back to the fleet because I'm going to help take care of my buddies back there. They love these. They love this. This is where Mare Island really became famous. And again, it's another reservist. This time, a guy by the name of Tafelmeyer, who was an Oakland orthopedist. He's a reservist called to active duty, and he comes here, and as an orthopedist, he's taking care of guys who lost their limbs. And he complains bitterly that the program for getting artificial limbs is horrible, because he has to do the measurements, he has to send the order out to some prosthetic maker someplace and wait 3 months for it to come back. And so finally, what does Mare Island have that's of significant importance? We have experienced machinists who can make fabulous artificial joints. And so he starts working with the machinists and develops his own artificial joints here. And the bottom is plastic, it's probably Bakelite, but again, the Navy has access to this stuff because, well, after all, we have access to this stuff. So, and another great thing is while they're developing this, the guys in the machine shop are the ones who put up the first $1,000 to build the brace shop where the guys to be taken care of could be done. So this is an example of, and it became so famous that Mare Island was named as the Navy's amputee care center for the West Coast, for the Marines and the sailors that came back with lost limbs. There's a letter in the file from the chief of orthopedics at the Army Hospital, Letterman, that he writes back to his bureau saying, I went over to Mare Island to inspect their prosthetic operation the other day, and I got to tell you, the prostheses they're using over there are vastly better than anything we have at a third the cost. Go Navy. So this is Tafelmeyer, and he actually, after the war, he becomes sort of an international amputee expert and prosthetic expert as well. And this is a guy by the name of Kessler, who was an East Coast rehabilitation doc, pretty famous. He came out here as a Navy captain, while Tafelmeyer, the Navy commander, designed the program, so he's kind of junior to the senior guy who didn't have anything to do with it, but now he has a chance to oversee it. That's what happens in the service, you know. Pioneering surgery. This is one of my favorite stories too. So there was a sailor who'd been injured at Pearl Harbor, just a small wound in his back. They sent him back out to the fleet. He wasn't doing well. He's complaining a lot of pain, so they sent him back to Pearl Harbor. They take a picture of him, and lo and behold, he's got a bullet lodged in his heart. Sent him to Mare Island. There's another guy with shrapnel, same thing. Well, it turns out there's a surgeon at Mare Island now who was, until recently, the chief of surgery at Stanford. He was by the name of Holman, Emil Holman. He'd been the last trainee of the famous surgeons at Johns Hopkins, came out to Stanford to run the surgical program. He was a pacifist, but at age 51, 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he volunteers for the Navy and they send him to Mare Island. So Holman sees this guy with a bullet lodged in his heart, and he says, well, you know, if I don't operate on you, you're probably going to die. If I operate on you, you could die. And the guy says, well, fix me. Okay? So, and Holman writes a paper on this. So he writes a paper saying, you know, I'm essentially scared to death because, you know, I'm just imagining as I take this bullet out, the wound is going to fill with blood, and that'll be the end of the story, right? Well, it turns out that's not the case. But I'm distracted. So this sailor who's about to either die or not, on his way to the operating room, looks up the nurse who's wheeling him down the passageway, saying, "Listen, if I survive this thing, will you go out on liberty with me?" And she says, "What am I going to say, right?" Well, he survives the operation. And so did the other guy with the shrapnel. So Holman was a pretty good surgeon, or lucky, or both. But anyway, so somebody tells me about this 102-year-old nurse who worked at Mare Island. And we met her, Gina and I met her. And she says, that was the guy, I'm the guy that he asked to go out on liberty. You know, I'm the gal that he asked me to go out on liberty with. So we went out on liberty a few times, and then they got married, and they were married for 37 years, and they had several kids. And this is her. She came back up to Mare Island. We brought her back up. I wanted to show her the nurses' residence up on Mare Island. And we drive up in front of the nurses' residence, which is the beautiful old Y-shaped Spanish Revival style building. Again, not traditional Navy construction. We did things differently here in California at one time. She gets out of the car and she points at a window and says, "That's the room that I had when I was a nurse here." So I mean, she remembered just like that. And actually, this is her meeting the dean. I think it's the dean of Touro University, who's now using her room as an office. But she just as sharp as a tack. 2 years later, I'm giving a talk at Mare Island. And lo and behold, in she comes in her wheelchair with her daughter behind her. And I tell this story. And after I get done, as I'm signing books, people are lining up with the book. They're having her sign the book. So this is the Naval Hospital at its height. I don't know, the wire's not going to let me go far. Oh, maybe it will. Oh gosh, good. Okay, so this is H1. This is the building that I showed you in the picture. This is the first fireproof construction. So one of the big complaints that they had from the beginning was this is a wooden structure. And so they were worried about fire. Please build us fireproof construction. So this ward, and this is the sick officers' quarters here. In the Navy, at least back in the day, I don't know how it is now, enlisted people and officers don't mix. They don't sleep in the same space. In fact, I lived in officers' country on the ship, and if the corpsman needed to talk to me, he knocked on the door and got permission to come into officers' country. I mean, that's the way it was. So sick officers, enlisted, that was built in the 20s. This ward here was built in the early 1940s. This is the last World War II construction on the hospital complex. It was called Owen Hall at the time, named after the World War II commanding officer of the hospital. It's now a central aspect to Touro University. I'll get back to that in a minute. These are the two remaining pavilions that were built as part of the emergency construction during World War I. What else can I tell you? The brace shop is right here. That's the amputee center. And so on. So the place, I don't know, 42 acres, 38 buildings, something like that. It was pretty big. Oh, so at its peak in World War II, it had a bed capacity of 2,300 people. Design capacity of 600. So what about 2,300 people? Well, in medicine we refer to a phenomenon called acuity. How sick are you really? And the vast number of these 2,300 people weren't very sick. They were either waiting to get better so they could either be sent back to the fleet or to be sent home, depending upon their condition. So all they needed until those administrative decisions were made is they needed a roof over their head, a bed to sleep in, and 3 squares a day. So that's where a lot of that 2,300 people came from. There were some sick ones, and of course there was still surgery being done and all that, but it was not what you might think. Oakland Naval Hospital, which opened in 1942, and incidentally that's my next project, had a bed capacity something like 4,500. So Mare Island is pretty small. And in point of fact, even before the war, McIntyre knew that Mare Island Naval Hospital had a limited life expectancy because it was small. They couldn't expand it because there was a hill going up behind where the golf course is, and the industrial plant was right in front of it. So they knew that it had a limited history, a limited future. And that's why they started planning other things. But the war sort of overtook things, so they had to use what they had, and so Mare Island became pretty busy and pretty famous as a Navy hospital. So I say nothing lasts forever. This is Oakland Naval Hospital. Now, the Navy looked for places for hospitals. Well, McIntyre was kind of a genius that way, too. There was a program, the government had a program to limit the number of hospitals that were being built. This was from the 1920s, and we still had to jump through those hoops even during World War II. But what McIntyre did was he looked for beds that were already built. He didn't have to get permission for them. So one of the places that had beds that were already built were country clubs or hotels, or in college dormitories. There was a little college on the East Coast, I don't remember the name of it, that was a rehab hospital during World War II, and I wanted to get more information about it. So I wrote to the librarian at the hospital saying, "Can you give me some information on the Naval Hospital that was on your campus?" And he wrote back saying, "We had no idea that there was a Navy hospital on our campus during World War II." So doors are open, it's a marvelous thing. Anyway, so this is Oakland Naval Hospital in its full development. It's huge. But you notice up there in the top, does anybody remember that there was a naval hospital in San Leandro, California? It was a psychiatric facility, built, I think it opened in 1944. the local neighborhood, and it was there even during the Korean War, and then it was torn down. But the local neighborhood, in that particular neighborhood of San Leandro, are quite proud of the fact that there was a naval hospital in their neighborhood. So that was the beginning of the end of Mare Island Naval Hospital, which closed in 1957. So what happened after that? Well, the place lay fallow for 5 years, and the Navy Schools Command opened in H1 and expanded it, as you can see, and then the name changed to the Combat Systems Technical Schools Command in 1972. And for a long time in these talks, I surmised that cyber warfare got its start at Mare Island. But I've since been disabused of that idea by people who were there. So no, can't claim cyber warfare. Anyway, the school command was closed in '95, and I think it's been moved to the southeast someplace. So that's 1995. Then what happens? Well, 4 years later, Torrey University of California moves in. How many knew that there was a university on Mare Island? I know most of you. Good. Did you know that there's a medical school on Mare Island? Most of you did know that. Yeah, pretty cool. So yeah, so Toro now owns the facility, and it's a challenge, I believe, because that whole hospital complex is a historical. It's a federally protected historical structure. So you can't really tear stuff down. I mean, it's to be historically preserved. You can do whatever you want on the inside of buildings, but you can't do anything on the exterior that changes its historical character. And you may imagine that running a medical school is an expensive proposition to start with, but then if you're trying to maintain or upgrade buildings on top of that, I mean, it's a daunting task, but they're at it. I mean, they've rehabilitated a couple of buildings, and they're using the structures for education. They have multiple medical programs there, as well as advanced degrees in education. It's quite the place. Now, I want to go back just for a brief moment. How am I doing on time, sweetie? Okay. My dear wife of 58 years. Gina, we were just back to Lafayette College for my 60th reunion. Yeah, 60th reunion. And we walked the old Zate house where we met on a blind date 62 years ago. Anyway, okay, so 3 themes for the book. Medical officers wear 2 hats. They're medical and they're military. And how do they balance these sometimes appearingly contradictory things? Now, contradictory meaning, for instance, if the government says there's not enough money for you to hire docs, how do you handle that? I mean, you do the best you can, but you know, the idea of trying to meet the needs of your patients and the requirements of the military sometimes requires some ingenuity, I suppose you could say. Then another theme is this California. I love the notion that California is the state of innovation. That we advance the art and science in so many ways here in California. And then finally, there's kind of a brief story, I think, of architecture telling the story of advances in medicine. There's a reason for that, but I'll try to reveal that shortly. So here's medical officers blending medical and military roles. So this was after the 1918 flu pandemic. The staff are exhausted. They're maybe a little demoralized because people have died, including 2 of their own doctors and a couple of their own nurses. So, you know, what to do? I mean, we can be military and have a stiff upper lip, but no, let's have a ward decorating contest for Christmas. So the commanding officer of the hospital at that time, one of my famous guys, a guy by the name of Fahrenholt, is also an amateur photographer. And during that flu pandemic, the Surgeon General was requesting from all the commanding officers of the hospitals to send back an informal letter every week, sort of reporting on what's going on. It was, quote, voluntary, but it was informal. What this guy did, and this, these magical things, you're at the archives, you're leafing through stuff, and with every letter there's a stack of maybe 8 to 10 photographs that he had made himself. He was an amateur photographer, and these pictures clearly hadn't seen the light of day since they'd been put in the archives in 1919 or something like that. And so that's what this is. This is one of his photographs. And why I think it's lovely is because it shows you what it looks like on the inside of a naval hospital in 1918 or 1919. And they had a gold cup for the best ward. They did that, so it was like that. And there's stories about the corpsmen going out in trucks out to the countryside to get wreaths and Christmas trees and stuff like that. I mean, they threw their hearts into it, as you can imagine. This is another innovation at Mare Island. This is not so much medical, although it is. This is an ambulance boat. It was built on the hull of a harbor tug. Mare Island made 3 of these. And you can imagine in the Bay Area, especially before we had bridges, if somebody gets hurt over in San Francisco, you send the ambulance boat over to pick it up. And I've got pictures of the interior. Unfortunately, I don't show it, but it's fitted out with bunks, and there's a small galley for food and all that kind of stuff. They built 3. 2 of them went to Norfolk, Virginia, and disappeared. This one was in service until 1937. And then finally, medical architecture reflecting advances in science. So the first, I would say, innovation that's represented by construction on Mare Island is the Alienist Hospital, which I don't have a picture of here. Alienist is the term in the 1920s for psychiatry. It's from the French. So it was the Alienist Hospital. It was a separate hospital, and I think it simply reflects that we have this specialty of psychiatry now, and we have to have a facility for it. And it was built properly. It was built, the second-story windows, and the building's still there. The second-story windows have got thick bars on the windows so that somebody feeling poorly, they're not jumping out of the windows, for crying out loud, and that kind of thing. They had sunrooms on it. One of the things we learned about this was that facility it had sunrooms, and it was an appropriate facility. One of the things we learned, there was a theory after World War I. A lot of guys came back with shell shock, it was called in the time. A lot of guys came back, and at the time it was thought, the psychiatric community, or at least some in the psychiatric community, thought you could filter out the guys who were susceptible to shell shock. We would call it PTSD now. So they went through all this testing and stuff. The guys that they thought were susceptible were sent off to be, medical care people in hospitals and stuff like that. But what we realized right away was you can't screen for that. I mean, war is hell. And guys are going to come back with PTSD. So what happens is this little psychiatric facility, which is 8-foot centers, single beds, it goes to triple bunks on 6-foot centers, and they put the sunrooms in, beds in the sunrooms too. They finally have to build they signed a contract with Napa State Hospital. Napa State Hospital completed a new 200-bed facility they were going to use for TB. We used it during the war. It was called the Imola Annex. So psychiatry is a thing. This one here just happens to be the lab building. So lab science becomes an important part of medicine. We have to have a building for a laboratory. Well, it's not so much that the building tells you that medicine is advancing. It's that the hospital doesn't have space for a lab, so you're going to build a lab, right? I mean, but I'll claim that medicine has, that architecture is showing the advance. My wife is telling me I've got 5 minutes. Bless your soul, sweetie. So Navy Hospital closes in '57. What happens to Navy medicine on Mare Island? Well, it doesn't go away. So what happens is in the first floor of that sick officers' quarters I showed you, they opened a clinic. So there was a Navy medical clinic in there until this facility was built, and I don't remember when this was. It was probably in the early '90s. A nice clinic, really modern clinic building. And when the Navy Yard closed in 1997, the VA took this over. So this is now the VA clinic, but it was originally a Navy clinic. That's my talk. Any questions? So I try to give this, thanks, I try to give this talk every couple of years to the students at Toro. And one of the things I try to remind them is that they're walking on hallowed ground over there. That people who lost limbs and were really sick and, protecting us, walk those grounds, and that they need to give thought to that, and we need to give thought to that whenever we walk the property. Oh, one other story aside. So the wooden building, after the fireproof construction was done, the wooden building became an administrative center except for two things. One, they had family practice there. The other is they had OB there. You know, OB in a fireproof, in a fire trap, for crying out loud. Well, I guess the notion was that even pregnant women can run downstairs or whatever if, you know, if there's a fire. Well, it turns out that original hospital was built in the shape of a T, so there was originally a pavilion that went off the back side. And on walking tours of the hospital, every once in a while I'll have somebody come up and say, listen, I was born here. And you know, back in the day, there was actually a Born on Mare Island club. They would get together every once in a while and talk about, well, so can you show me where I was born? Well, it turns out that back pavilion was amputated probably during the time the schools command ran it. So all I can do is point to where the third deck might have been and say, you were probably born about there, but you know, it's no longer there, but OB was there too. Anyway, questions? You ready to have some Prosecco and cookies? And
Did you come across any information about First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's visit?
The question is, any information about Eleanor Roosevelt's visit? Yeah, on my other slideshow, I show this picture. Oh, it's a great picture. I should have it here. It's a great picture. It shows the nurses lined up, you know, in formation, and the commanding officer of the hospital, a Navy captain, and Eleanor Roosevelt walking past the nurses. And there are two stories in the picture. One is the nurses are delighted. They're leaning in, they're smiling. The Navy captain, probably a Republican. So two great stories, but yeah, so she was here. I can't tell you anything more than what that picture shows, but she really did make the rounds, and she was a wonderful, yeah.
So, Tom, you mentioned that people being born on the island. This is a question for the audience. Anybody born on Mare Island?
Is there anybody born on Mare Island here? One? What year?
45.
45. Whoa, so early, yeah.
Still active duty military.
yeah. Outstanding. Thanks for that. Well, you know, I just read today that the last World War II ace just passed away at 103. I mean, we're all suffering a certain level of attrition. We're glad to have you here with us. You know, it's like still on active duty. Yeah. Other questions?
Does Turo have control of the old buildings now?
Yes, they own them.
And is there any tenable thing to do in the future? Or?
So the question is does Toro own the buildings in the hospital complex? And the answer is yes, they own them. And do they have plans? Yes. And in fact, they've done a complete rehabilitation of a building. I don't remember the name of it now, but it was, at the time, it was like the infectious disease building. It was built in the 30s. And they've done a complete rehabilitation of that building, and it looks beautiful. Now again, reconstruction, especially, you know, where you're trying to do historical preservation too, ain't cheap. So, you know, it's not like they can do it out of their operating revenue. They have to get grants and stuff like this, and it's a slow process, which I suspect is going to become a whole bunch slower now, you know. But yeah, they really are being very conscientious about trying to maintain, you know. There is this notion in the architecture business of demolition by neglect. Well, there's no evidence that they're practicing demolition by neglect. They're trying to maintain. Even just the idea of repairing the earthquake damage has taken a few years, but they finally got the money and they're spending the money to do it. Yes?
The archivists you spoke about at the beginning, where do they get their funding?
Oh, so the question is the archivists. So the National Archives, which is where most of this material exists, that's a federal program. So, and I'm not sure exactly what, Department of Interior maybe? I'm not sure. So Congress has to appropriate money for the National Archives, and out of that, I presume the archivists are paid. You know, there are lots of private foundations out there that manage, say, for instance, a museum like our museum here. And if they're big enough and well enough funded, they'll also have archivists, private archivists, to help maintain their collections.
But unfortunately, we don't. And we don't get federal funding.
Not quite big enough yet. Trevor, but you're working at it.
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
I believe you've done tours of the hospital in years past.
So the question is, I believe you've done tours of the hospital in years past. The answer is I don't get access to the interiors very often, but we do walking tours. And in fact, do you know about the Mare Island Historic Park Foundation? It's a foundation that actually is being run right now by Kent Fortner, who's the president and CEO of Mare Island Brewing. They've undertaken, well, they essentially preserve the chapel over there, and I think 2 or 3 other structures they're responsible for. They also operate tours, and we're trying to reintroduce the hospital tours as part of that. Yeah, again, the idea of walking hallowed ground and touching history, including Dennis Jordan's bricks. You know, if that's that, there is Prosecco, there are cookies, and also I guess they're going to set me up to sign books if anybody wants to buy one and have it signed.
Spanish-American War.
Yes.
I think there were some casualties in the Philippines that ended up in the hospital.
Yes.
And buried at the Mare Island Naval Hospital.
Yes, that's right. Nestor Aliga, one of my dear friends and supporters and promoters. Nestor is one of those citizens that is continually active in doing things to improve our community, to inform people about our community. Anyway, yeah, certainly we did. In fact, that was the question was around this, you know, the war in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War, and then all of a sudden we have an empire now, and we have a much larger Pacific fleet now, and we're going to have people coming back, people who are injured or people who are sick, who have tropical diseases who are going to be coming back. We need to have more facilities at Mare Island. So this was another justification for enlarging our facilities. But yes, that was really the beginning of the growth. I mean, the original notion was, so the original, I could go on forever. So you just, when you're tired, just get up and leave. Listen, when did the Americans develop a Pacific Squadron? I mean, you know, we're a European nation. Now all of a sudden, we have to have ships in the Pacific. Why do we have to have ships in the Pacific? A Pacific Squadron of about 5 ships originally. Why? Well, you've got American sailors out there getting shipwrecked that need to be rescued. You've got Americans out there who may be not obeying the law, so you need to have law enforcement. The Brits, the Royal Navy, which is the naval hegemon of the world at that point, they're the most powerful navy. The Brits are sniffing around the Sandwich Islands, which we're also interested in. We call that Hawaii now. So they're sniffing around. Also, there's a border dispute up on the Washington-Canada border, and we need to have an American presence up there. So these are the reasons why we need to have a Pacific Squadron. Well, but where are you going to home port the Pacific Squadron until California becomes a state? I mean, it's Mexican territory, so you're not going to. So what do? We home port them in Peru and in Chile. So our ships are actually home ported down there, and then whoa, California becomes a state in 1850. In 1850, the Navy's already sent. This is the second team to study a place for an anchorage for our Pacific Squadron. Interestingly enough, the instructions had said nothing about Southern California. It was all about the San Francisco Bay. So there was a committee of naval officers came out, spent a month in the Bay Area, and they were the ones that decided that this Mare Island would be the ideal place. A, it's protected from weather. B, it would be a little bit inconvenient for the Royal Navy to roll into the Bay Area and try to attack our fleet. So it was the ideal place for an anchorage for our fleet, and that's how Mare Island was chosen. Another question.
Really quick question. How many naval hospitals are left?
The question is, how many naval hospitals are left? I don't know. That's a good research question for me. I mean, we've got some overseas. You know, we've got Naples. We've got in Japan. I don't know how many are in America. We've certainly closed down. I mean, the Oakland Naval Hospital in 1942 closed in 1997 as part of. There was a process called BRAC. It was Base Realignment and Closure. And that's what happened with Mare Island. Was it was decided that we didn't need this base anymore, so that's why Mare Island went away. A lot of naval hospitals got that too. Yeah. So, I don't have an answer for you. Sorry. And you know, there's a trend in the military too. inside stuff, right? I'm actually working on a paper on this. It's called Purple Suit Medicine. Now you use your imagination to combine Air Force blue and Army green and Navy blue, and that's supposed to be purple. In other words, there's going to be a universal military service, not service related, and that's really controversial, particularly among Army and Navy docs. I don't know about the Air Force docs, but we're Navy, and we think a special way about things. And I mean, we're already doing that with enlisted people. All of the enlisted, the corpsmen, the Army corpsmen, Air Force, and Navy, all go through their basic training, a base training series, and then they split off for the last couple of weeks for service-specific training. And there's specific needs for the Navy. I mean, if nothing else, going down to sea in ships, for crying out loud. What else? Go drink. Go do something. Thanks again.